the years since July 16th of 1910, when the first aircraft took flight in Australia, the country has been the scene of a number of fascinating aviation mysteries. From the unsolved crash of Trans-Australia Airlines Flight 538 off the coast of Queensland in June of 1960, to the vanishing of Frederick Valentich and his Cessna over the Bass Strait after he reported seeing a strange aircraft following him in 1978, and the disappearance of Victor Hotel Mike Delta X-Ray in the Barrington Tops National Park on August 9, 1981, the country has produced many mysteries that have yet to be solved. Today, however, we'll be looking at 3 cases that were once in a similar category, but by chance and good fortune, will be solved decades after their final flights. Prior to March of 1931, the nation of Australia had not seen a major aviation accident. According to the Aviation Safety Network, there were only 4 plane crashes in the country, with a death toll over 2. This wouldn't and couldn't be the case forever. Australia's aviation industry was growing. One of the major players in the burgeoning industry was Australian National Airlines. ANA was founded by Australian aviation pioneers Charles Kingsford Smith and Charles Ulm. The 2 men had become national heroes after successfully flying a Fokker 7 across the Pacific in 1928, performing the first trans-Pacific flight from the US to Australia. They had used their fame to found the new airline, performing scheduled passenger flights in eastern Australia starting on July 1st of 1930. These flights were performed by 5 Avro 10s. The 2 main routes covered by the airline connected Brisbane and Melbourne to Sydney. The airline was in distress early on as the Great Depression was hitting the industry hard. It was under these conditions that Southern Cloud departed Sydney for a flight to Melbourne on March 21, 1931. The Southern Cloud was the first Avro 10 to roll off the production line. The Avro 10 was a license-built version of the Fokker 7 used by Smith and Ulm. The aircraft was flown by Captain Travis Shortridge and assistant pilot Charles Dunnell. They were carrying 6 passengers. The pilots had been given a weather report that morning indicating decent, if not perfect, weather would be encountered. Some rain and thunderstorm activity were predicted, but it was deemed safe for the aircraft to depart sometime between 8 and 8:30 in the morning. There was a problem with this forecast, however. Weather forecasts were based on observations taken at 9 a.m. and were only prepared once per day. As Southern Cloud departed Sydney prior to 9 a.m. on the 21st, the crew was provided with the previous day's forecast. Sometime around 10 in the morning, and about 2 hours after Southern Cloud left for Melbourne, a more concerning reality developed as a strong cold front not predicted the previous day approached Sydney. At around 10:30, the new weather report would arrive, confirming the new weather conditions. This new report indicated that decent weather would continue until 10 a.m., when a strong cold front was expected to arrive. This sort of weather was more common in the winter months, but would occasionally occur during the summer as well. There was no way of informing the crew of the danger, as the aircraft was not fitted with radio equipment. It was normal for aircraft of the time to not be fitted with radios. Harold Cam, a meteorologist stationed in Sydney, contacted Charles Ulm and informed him of the situation. The 2 men waited for word from Wangaratta, the aircraft's refueling stop, of the Southern Cloud's arrival. They could only hope that the aircraft would fight through the clouds, strong turbulence, and headwinds over the Southern Alps to safety. Their hopes were dashed once the time of fuel exhaustion had passed without any report of the aircraft landing. Searches would soon begin for Southern Cloud. It was initially believed that the aircraft had made it into Victoria, as reports of an aircraft passing near Wangaratta and Violet Town were made. The plane was reportedly seen near Adelong. The aircraft was believed to have been lost in the clouds and rain as it turned away from Wangaratta towards Holbrook. Further reports were made of the aircraft heading back towards Benalla and Yea. Most of these witnesses only heard the aircraft, though at least 2 saw the aircraft briefly before it faded back into the clouds. ANA's remaining aircraft would be dispatched to participate in the search, alongside Smith and Ulm. Other aircraft would join the search, as well as a number of ground searchers. By the 23rd, Charles Ulm was convinced that the aircraft was located between Wangaratta and Seymour. Later that day, it was assumed that the aircraft was located in the forests around Yei. An ANA pilot planned to fly over the area the following morning, carrying food and water for any survivors he found. He hoped to find the wreck by noon. Fuel exhaustion was the presumed cause at this point, though a controlled flight into terrain was also considered. Searches lasted for 18 days without finding a trace of the aircraft. The deadliest plane crash in Australian history up to that point, and the first major airline disaster, would thus remain a mystery. ANA would be seriously damaged by the crash. The airline cancelled its scheduled flights later in 1931 and closed for good after the crash of the Southern Sun while it was attempting to fly Christmas letters to England on November 26, 1931. There would be a few interesting footnotes to this case. After the collapse of ANA, Charles Ulm would found Great Pacific Airways, an airline which intended to perform a scheduled air service between San Francisco and Sydney. In December of 1934, he would perform a test flight along the planned route. During the flight to Hawaii, the crew would report being lost and eventually ditched the aircraft. No trace of the three crew or the airspeed envoy they were flying would ever be found. Similar fate would befall Charles Kingsford Smith, who disappeared off the coast of modern-day Myanmar while attempting to break the England to Australia speed record in November of 1935. Lastly, a man named Stan Baker was booked to fly aboard Southern Cloud during its final flight. He had cancelled prior to the flight, saving his life. He would subsequently harbor a fear of flying. This would not stop him from boarding an Australian National Airways DC-4 that was flying from Perth to Adelaide and Melbourne on June 26, 1950. Shortly after takeoff from Perth, the DC-4 lost all power on its engines and crashed east of the city, killing everyone on board. By late February of 1945, the Second World War was coming to a close. Though the city of Darwin, located on the north coast of Australia, had come under attack earlier in the war, soldiers and sailors stationed there were now more concerned about the monotonous diet they were being fed. Bringing fresh produce to Darwin was easier said than done, as the city was located far away from the more hospitable and populated parts of the country. The solution came in the form of fat cat flights. Old bombers would be flown from Darwin to larger cities with a large amount of money on board. Upon arrival, the crew would purchase fresh fruit and vegetables, alcohol, ice cream, and live poultry, and bring them back to Darwin. One of the aircraft participating in the Fat Cat runs was Beautiful Betsy, a consolidated B-24D Liberator belonging to the 380th Bomb Group of the U.S. Air Force. The B-24 received its name from its first pilot, who had named it after his wife. The bomber would perform its first mission on June 15, 1943, in Timor. The aircraft would evade the Japanese during its short career, but would still suffer more than its fair share of abuse. In 1944, the aircraft would be severely damaged by a storm and heavy landing, and was deemed unfit for combat after 25 missions. Not wanting to discard the aircraft, it was modified to serve as a parachute training platform. It was then stripped of paint and weaponry and repurposed for Fat Cat flights. Late on February 26th of 1945, Betsy was prepared for another routine flight, this time to Brisbane. The plane was loaded with 600 Australian pounds. A pair of RAF officers boarded the plane. Flying Officer Roy Cannon and Flight Lieutenant Thomas Cook both flew Spitfires for the 548th Squadron. Cannon was due to be married in Brisbane on March 3rd, while Cook would be his best man. The aircraft departed around 10 or 11 p.m. The aircraft would fly over Claraville, apparently the site of a navigation station, before heading direct to Brisbane. It was expected that the aircraft would be in the air for 10 hours. Though there was a radio operator on board, it is unclear if there was any expectation of routine communication from the flight. No communications are noted. A witness heard a large 4-engine plane fly over Claraville around 3 a.m. on the 27th, though the whereabouts of this sighting are disputed. Beautiful Betsy would fail to arrive at Brisbane. The day after, 2 more Liberators were sent out to fly between Darwin and Brisbane to look for the missing bomber. On the way back, they performed a more detailed search around Claraville. Nothing was found on either flight. Other search efforts apparently occurred but are not detailed. Appeals for information from the public would also turn up nothing. In 1967, a bomb bay drop tank and supercharger belonging to a B-24 were found near Elsey Station, around 360 kilometers southeast of Darwin. The supercharger appeared to have been stored in a box which had deteriorated. During the subsequent search, Aboriginal stockmen would show police and Royal Australian Air Force men a dried-up waterhole. A cigarette lighter, carbine ammo, American coins, and metal buttons belonging to a U.S. military uniform were found. A number of utensils had previously been found there. There were rumors of a propeller and fuselage being found previously as well, but searchers were unable to find anything else. In October of 1982, 3 Aboriginal men informed police that they had found the wreck of a bomber that contained human remains. A 5-day search assisted by a helicopter pilot would be launched. Neither the Royal Australian Air Force nor the men could find the wreck. Though not clearly stated, this search appears to have occurred in the same general area as the 1967 search. The Canberra Times reported on May 28, 1983, that an anthropologist studying Aboriginal artwork around the Robinson River had recently discovered art that appeared to depict a C-47 and B-24. A C-47 was known to have crashed in the area previously, but no known B-24 crash was noted. Another search was planned for the following dry season, but presumably failed to find anything. Between 1973 and 1976, Australia would experience a particularly nasty La Niña, bringing with it heavy rains. Of particular note was 1974, which was the wettest year on record in Australia. January of 1974 would see large parts of Queensland, the Northern Territory, and New South Wales encountering record rainfall. Queensland was hit particularly hard, with the state suffering widespread flooding. This was worsened by Tropical Cyclone Wanda, which passed by the state in late January. The city of Brisbane was hard hit, suffering devastating flooding as a result of the storm. This poor weather continued into February. Among the many people inconvenienced by the unusual rainfalls were Edward and Elizabeth Smith. The Smiths were attempting to fly from Gladstone to Longreach in Queensland. They had tried to make the flight the day prior, but poor weather had forced them to return after 34 minutes. Edward Smith was the owner of a Beechcraft Baron, registered Victor Hotel Foxtrot Whiskey Romeo. At 52 years old, he had 1,750 total flying hours. He was properly certified for the Baron and had over 450 hours in the type. He did not hold any instrument rating, giving him yet more reason to avoid flying a small plane through the storms blanketing Queensland. There was no evidence indicating that the aircraft was in poor repair. It was fitted with radio equipment deemed adequate for the long ranges needed for flights over the Outback. The Smiths would try their luck again on the 16th. Around 9:10 in the morning, Edward Smith called the Rockhampton Flight Service Unit to request the latest weather. Wind was expected to come from the east-northeast, with scattered stratus clouds between 1,000 to 2,000 feet, broken cumulus clouds between 2,000 and 14,000, and scattered clouds around 12,000 feet. Visibility was generally expected to be 15 miles, though that was expected to drop below 3,000 yards. Rain showers and moderate turbulence were also expected. While he was on the phone, Smith was informed of another aircraft which had been flying from the Lake Galilee area to Rockhampton. After encountering bad weather west of Claremont, the aircraft diverted to Barcaldine. This would not dissuade Smith from leaving Gladstone. He submitted his flight plan to Rockhampton, indicated his intention to fly direct to Longreach while flying below 5,000 feet. He told Rockhampton that he would give a SAR time once he was off the ground. A SAR time was the time at which a search should be initiated for an aircraft. By doing this, he indicated that he would not be providing the ground with regular position reports. He would instead call Rockhampton upon landing to cancel the SAR time watch. Finally, he indicated the flight would be performed under visual flight rules and that the aircraft had 330 minutes worth of fuel on board. Only Edward Smith and his wife would be aboard the aircraft. Whiskey Romeo departed Gladstone Airport from runway 10 at 9:53. 1 minute later, Smith contacted Rockhampton. He gave an estimated flight time of 114 minutes and a SAR time of 12 o'clock. He then acknowledged the current time and altimeter setting. This was the last time anyone heard from the aircraft. The aircraft would not arrive at Longreach by 12 o'clock, prompting the Longreach Flight Service Unit to declare the uncertainty phase of search and rescue operations. At 1:23, this was escalated to the alert phase. Finally, at 3:22 p.m., the time when the aircraft was expected to have run out of fuel, this was escalated to the distress phase. Searches would last from the 16th to the 25th of February. Witnesses reported hearing or seeing the aircraft, though where these reports came from is not said. Civilian and military aircraft would fly a total of 532 hours, covering an area exceeding 40,000 square miles. Areas of high probability were thoroughly examined, though where these areas were was not detailed in the report. The report mentions that the eastern part of the search area was covered in dense mountainous terrain and dense foliage, suggesting that the high probability areas were located somewhere in this region. Looking west, less foliage is present, making a wrecked aircraft easier to see. Despite the efforts of searchers, no trace of Whiskey Romeo or the Smiths was found. Prior to the Second World War, Australia's electricity network was underdeveloped. The war and subsequent ramping up of domestic production would push the system beyond its limits. Some great effort would be required to improve the grid. The answer came in the form of the Snowy Mountains, located in New South Wales and Victoria. These mountains were the source of multiple major rivers and were found to be suitable for producing hydroelectric power. Due to disputes amongst the government of New South Wales and the governments of Victoria and South Australia over the interruption of river flow, the federal government would take over the project. This would be the start of the Snowy Mountains scheme, which would see multiple hydroelectric dams built in the Snowy Mountains for power generation and irrigation purposes. The bulk of the work occurred between 1949 and 1972. To complete the project, a great many immigrants from war-torn Europe were enticed to move to Australia in order to work on the scheme. As part of the scheme, a series of access roads cutting through the mountains were constructed. One such road was built near Deep Creek, near Mount Blackjack and Jagumba Mountain. On October 26, 1958, one worker on the Snowy Mountains scheme decided to take a walk through the bush. While on his walk, Tom Saunter would notice something unusual. A large object moved under his feet as he stepped on it. Upon closer inspection, this object turned out to be a wing. He would inform authorities of his discovery. Searchers would find the wreck 2 miles from the Deep Creek access road. Despite the close proximity of the crash site to the road, it took the search team an hour and a half to reach it. The wreck was located 300 to 400 feet from the top of a steep gorge. The area is covered in dense vegetation, which, combined with the gorge, formed what was called a perpetual twilight at the crash site. Upon reaching the wreck, searchers began examining the wreckage. The aircraft's 3 engines were half buried, while the searchers needed to dig out the fuselage to search for personal belongings and remains. During this process, they found an identification plate which confirmed what many had suspected. The wreck of Southern Cloud had been found after 27 years. Examination of the wreckage would reveal that the aircraft had been flying northeast around 4,500 feet at the time of impact. Southern Cloud had struck the ground while in a sharp starboard turn. The aircraft hit the ground with extreme force, likely killing all 8 on board instantly. A gold watch found in the wreck had stopped at 1:15. Details such as a number of coins fused together suggest the aircraft burned after crashing. While the initial search efforts in 1931 appear to have been focused around Wangaratta, a few reports from the time suggested that the Deep Creek area was the final resting place of the aircraft. A shepherd reportedly found a sick bag discarded from an aircraft in the Marigal Valley. The bag contained a message reading simply, quote, "Flying low, visibility very bad," end quote. Instead of handing it over to the authorities, the shepherd used it to kindle a fire. A trio of prospectors camping in the area reported seeing an aircraft flying just above the treetops. 3 men camped around Mount Blackjack separately heard a plane flying nearby, followed by an explosion. In Tintaldra, a plume of smoke was seen. The available evidence suggests that the crew got lost after encountering the storm. After flying around looking for a landing area for a while, the plane ended up far to the east of the flight path. Instead of flying over flat farmland, the aircraft was now flying over the mountains. Visibility was poor, and the crew didn't see the approaching terrain near Deep Creek until the last second. Crew initiated a right turn in a desperate attempt to avoid the collision. Their efforts were in vain, and the plane flew into terrain at 1:15, killing all on board. Witness sightings near the expected flight path drew attention away from the crash site and towards the state of Victoria instead of New South Wales. By the time that search efforts were directed away from this area, the fires would have gone out, making it nearly impossible to find the wreck below the dense, dark foliage of the Deep Creek area. Memorials for the Southern Cloud would be built at the crash site to the west near Cooma and in Cooma. The site at Cooma would include the salvaged remains of the aircraft's engines. A creek near the crash site would be renamed after the Southern Cloud's captain, Travis Shortridge. 1994 was a particularly dry year in the state of Queensland, with much of the state seeing below-average rainfall. This created conditions suitable for large, devastating brush fires. To mitigate this threat, authorities planned out a series of controlled burns in the region. One such burn would occur in the Crumbit Tops National Park, around 400 kilometers north-northwest of Brisbane. Either during the burn, or while inspecting its aftermath, Park Ranger Mark Rowe would see something metallic that had been revealed by the flames. Upon closer inspection, he would realize that he had found the remains of an aircraft. When exactly this discovery occurred is unclear. The Canberra Times reported on August 31st that the discovery occurred 4 weeks ago. This would put the discovery as occurring in late July or early August. Most sources I could find seemed to point to July. The wreck was soon identified as belonging to a B-24. Beautiful Betsy had been found after 49 years. The location of the crash was initially kept secret to deter scavenging. In late August, a specialist team from the US Army would arrive to assist Australian authorities and excavate the site. They would find the remains of the crew members and their personal belongings during the search. It appears as though the remains of all on board the aircraft were accounted for, though this is unclear. Among the items recovered were 9 dog tags and buttons from both US Air Force and Royal Air Force uniforms. No distress call was made prior to the crash. The remains of the propellers showed that the engines were running at the time of impact. The engines were thrown 100 meters uphill on impact, indicating that the aircraft had hit the ground at a high speed. The landing gear was raised at the moment of impact, and there was nothing to indicate that the crew had attempted to bail from the aircraft. The only identifiable part of the fuselage remaining is the tail. Combined, these details suggest that the aircraft hit the ground in a steep dive, killing all on board instantly. It appears that no cause was determined for the crash, likely due to the lack of survivors or witnesses, extreme damage to the wreck, and nearly a half-century of deterioration in the Australian wilds. Like the Southern Cloud, searches were focused in the wrong area. Initial searches were very small, consisting of only 2 bombers flying along the route, performing a more detailed search around Clareville, where a credible sighting was made. It is clear that nobody had any idea where the aircraft crashed. The searches in the 1960s and 1980s were focused between Darwin and Clareville. In hindsight, there was little reason to believe that the aircraft went down in the Northern Territory. The discovery of a drop tank and supercharger appear unrelated to any accident. The supercharger was in a box when it fell to the ground, while a drop tank falling from an aircraft is neither unusual nor remarkable. The items found near the dried water hole merely indicate that US military personnel were in the area during the Second World War, with nothing indicating that they belonged to the crew of the aircraft. The report of a wreck being found in 1982 was not proven. The anthropologist's discovery near the Robinson River is interesting, but doesn't necessarily prove the presence of a B-24 wreck in the region. The only credible sighting was made near Clareville. The aircraft would have continued towards Brisbane, not back towards the Northern Territory. If for some reason the aircraft needed to divert after this point, they would have made some sort of call on the radio and likely found somewhere in Queensland to put the plane down in, rather than quietly return to Darwin and crash for some reason. Without any evidence to the contrary, a crash site in eastern Queensland should have been assumed. Indeed, the crash site is located to the east of the expected flight path between Clareville and Brisbane, perhaps explaining why the wreck wasn't found by searchers in the Queensland area. The area the plane crashed in is located in an isolated area. The nearest traces of civilization are almost 20 kilometers away from the crash site, suggesting why nobody saw the plane crash or made any reports in the aftermath of the disappearance. In the years after its discovery, a hiking trail and information signs about the aircraft and its story were built at the crash site. The weather in Queensland throughout the 1990s would be the opposite of that seen in 1974. For most of the 1990s, the state would see average or below average rainfall. The lack of rain had caused many of the trees around the region to die off. Sometime in May of 1998, a helicopter pilot was performing a routine flight to Emerald. While flying over a tree-covered hillside, he saw the remains of a small blue and white aircraft on the ground. Police would investigate the report and found the remains of Victor Hotel Foxtrot Whiskey Romeo after 24 years. There is very little information regarding this case. It's unclear where the aircraft wreck was found. It was likely located in a wooded area near Emerald, though beyond that I can't really be sure. ASN gives a location of 200 kilometers west-southwest of Rockhampton. This location is near Emerald, but doesn't make any sense. This area is mostly flat, barren ranch land located near a road. This is most likely an approximate distance. Looking about 10 kilometers back towards Rockhampton lies the Amaru State Forest, a more credible final resting place. Alternatively, looking even further east, we find the Expedition Range, which also matches the description of the crash site. A newspaper from May of 1998 points to this range being the crash site. If we combine this with the ASN's claim, this might put the crash site in Arthur's Bluff State Forest or Blackdown Tableland National Park. A blog post by Greg Blackmore, a former bush pilot who was involved in the search at the time of the plane's disappearance, provided more information. He had been tasked with searching the Baralaba, Gladstone, Stanwell, Mount Helen, and Mount Morgan areas. These locations are all to the east of the crash site, though other pilots were checking the rest of the route, including the accident area. Blackmore claims that the crash site was in the Blackdown Tableland area. A direct route between Gladstone and Longreach would fly directly over this area. I was unable to find any photographs of the crash site, though the newspaper article from 1998 provides a description. The wings and fuselage were largely intact, while the fuselage was scattered far and wide. The aircraft was still in good enough condition that the registration and paint scheme was still visible. One notable difference between this crash and those of the Southern Cloud and Beautiful Betsy is the lack of human remains. It was noted by authorities that this was not unusual due to the amount of time that had passed. This is questionable due to the aforementioned cases. Southern Cloud had been missing for 27 years and remains were still found. Perhaps even more interesting is the case of Beautiful Betsy. The B-24 was located in a similar part of Queensland, located about 60 kilometers from the flight path of Whiskey Romeo and 200 kilometers from the Blackdown Tablelands National Park. It had been missing for about twice as long, but human remains were still found. There are a few explanations for this. The disappearance of Whiskey Romeo was quite obscure when compared to the cases of the Southern Cloud and Beautiful Betsy. Police may not have put as much effort into searching the crash site as those searching the wrecks of the other aircraft. In both cases, excavation was required in order to find remains. In contrast, the remains of the Smiths may not have been buried and would have been predated upon by animals, as the crash appears to have been less violent. Alternatively, the Smiths may have initially survived the crash only to get lost in the forests and perish. As for the cause of the crash, weather seems to be a likely factor. A controlled flight into terrain is possible, as the terrain is hilly, rising as high as 2,500 feet in the Arthur's Bluff State Forest and 3,000 feet in the Blackdown Tablelands Park. The plane was supposedly found on a hillside. The plane was supposed to fly below 5,000 feet. Turbulence or bad weather could have also been responsible. This may have been worsened by Edward Smith's lack of an instrument rating, which meant he was likely unfamiliar with flying in poor visibility. Cloud layers were present below 5,000 feet. The crash was likely sudden, as no distress call was made. Thick cloud layers were present below 5,000 feet. The crash was likely sudden, as no distress call was made. 2 airstrips are located nearby to the likely crash site. The town of Blackwater is home to a small paved strip, while a deserted airstrip is located south of Stewarton. I'm unsure if these strips existed in 1974. The abandoned strip doesn't appear to have been abandoned for a particularly long time, so if it did exist at the time, it was likely open. It It is also unclear if these strips had navigation aids installed at any point. Flying through the area at a low altitude in a flight simulator, I found it very hard to locate any airstrip without the use of NDBs or the live map provided in X-Plane 11. Obviously, Smith did not have the latter, and not all airstrips have the former. In fact, most in this region appear to lack such a device. Regardless, the vast swaths of flat territory covering the region could have provided an opportunity to perform a survivable crash landing, or at least enabled the wreck to be found sooner, thus reinforcing the likelihood of a sudden crash. The lack of information on the case, by far the least available for any of the cases discussed, means I can't really analyze it more than this. I hope you enjoyed this video. I was a bit unsure of what to do for this one at first. I had some ideas lined up, but they were either too big for a video at the moment, or I just didn't like them very much. Fortunately, I've already decided what I'll do for the next one, so stay tuned for that. As for work on the next set of bigger videos, I've made some decent progress. As of the writing of this video, I have the basic models for 2 of the 3 brand new aircraft done. I was originally planning to do all 3 at once, but I tried some new techniques on one of the new aircraft, and I would like to test it a bit more before I'd apply it to the 3rd model. Right now, I'll try to get the first of the 6 aircraft I have lined up to be 3D printed and complete the fuselage redo and interior for the 2nd aircraft. I'll likely be well on my way to finishing these by the time this video comes out. I would like to have all 6 3D printed before the weather gets cold so I can leave the windows open for some ventilation. Until then, I thank you for watching the videos and, well, I have some models to print.